Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking on something really fundamental, how human memory gets written down. Because let's face it, history isn't just, a list of facts in the past. It's a narrative. And that narrative, well, it's always shaped by whoever's holding the pen.
Exactly. And if you, listening, want a kind of shortcut to understanding the huge shifts in power and technology, and frankly, moral responsibility that define how we remember, well, this is it. We're tracking who got to write history, starting way back in 1500, a time when it was very much controlled by the elites. And we'll take it all the way up to a projected future, maybe 2050, where algorithms might be shaping our past.
Okay, so let's set that scene. 1500, you said highly centralized. What does that actually look like? History is a state project.
Pretty much, yeah. The power to write history was concentrated in basically two places, the throne and the altar. So you've got your monarchs, the royal courts, imperial scribes, chroniclers, and alongside them, powerful religious institutions. Think the Catholic Church in Europe or, major Islamic scholars elsewhere. These were really the only groups with the literacy, the resources, and frankly, the political need to document things over wide areas.
And the tools they had were slow, right? Manuscripts, scrolls, everything copied by hand. Plus, you still had strong oral traditions, I suppose, and theological interpretations framing everything.
Absolutely. Oral traditions were vital, but harder to control or preserve consistently. And those theological commentaries were key. The history they produced, it was overwhelmingly Eurocentric or theocratic, depending on the region. Its main job wasn't just recording events. It was explicitly about justifying conquest, justifying their power, asserting divine right. History was, in effect, propaganda for the powerful.
Okay, but hold on. Wasn't the church, for example, also credited with preserving a lot of classical knowledge, keeping literacy alive during darker periods? Was the exclusion of other stories always, malicious? Or partly just a side effect of the tech and the need to save something?
That's a really important distinction. It's probably both, isn't it? Yes, they preserved what they valued, what fit their worldview. But the undeniable consequence of that centralized power was the systematic erasure or just the ignoring of indigenous cultures, non-literate societies. If your story didn't fit their power structure, or if you didn't use their specific way of recording things, your history wasn't just missed, it was often actively written out of the picture. History became what the winners decided to remember.
Right. That makes the jump to 1900 really interesting then. 4 centuries later, we're moving from history justifying God's chosen rulers to history justifying the modern nation state and the industrial boom. Who gets the pen now?
The authority definitely shifts. It moves away from the personal whim of a king more towards institutions. History gets institutionalized, professionalized even. So the key authors are now less the lone court chronicler and more, say, historians and universities. Also colonial governments, their bureaucracies, writing reports, keeping records. And critically, the rising power of newspaper editors, publishers, the people controlling mass media for the first time.
So mass printing. Industrial scale, that changes everything. We get standardized school curricula, national archives, official textbooks. It probably felt more democratic because more people could read history, right? But it sounds like it was just centralization under a different, maybe more efficient banner.
That's a great way to put it. The framing absolutely changed. Less theocratic, much more nationalist and industrialist. This history was doing a job. Mass printing, national schools, they were building a unified workforce, a common identity, a market even. And the history they wrote, it was often tailored specifically to justify colonial expansion overseas and back home to reinforce the kind of racial and class hierarchies needed to run those new factories.
So building the useful citizen was part of the goal, not just recording the past, but even with the university professors now writing history, who was still getting left out or downplayed.
Well, even though the sheer amount of history being written exploded, the scope of whose stories were deemed important, that stayed pretty narrow. The sources really point to the very limited inclusion of women's perspective, the stories of ordinary workers, laborers in those factories. And certainly the viewpoints of colonized peoples themselves were rarely given legitimacy. The academic elites often wrote history about the state, for the state, anything challenging that tended to be minimized.
Okay, let's jump again. Another century. Year 2000. The information revolution hits. Suddenly, that tight control held by publishers and universities, it starts to crack, right? because of digital tech, globalization.
Oh, it's a massive shift, a tectonic shift, really. You still have academic historians, journalists, of course, but now they're joined by just this huge new range of voices, social movements, finding their platforms online, NGOs, publishing reports, independent creators, bloggers. Suddenly, you don't necessarily need a giant institution behind you to get your story out to potentially millions.
The internet's the obvious channel, but you're saying the real game changer, the thing that enables this, is things like open source archives, digital libraries, access.
Access is absolutely central. That's the power shift.
Right.
And what that access fuels is, well, the inevitable rise of counter-histories, revisionism, people challenging the old narratives. History stops feeling like this fixed thing handed down from on high. It becomes contested, negotiated, alive. And we start seeing, really, for the first time in a mainstream way, those previously marginalized voices push through. Feminist history, indigenous perspectives, the complex stories of diasporas, all directly challenging that 1900s nation-state narrative.
That sounds like progress, definitely.
Yeah.
More voices, more stories. But this freedom, you mentioned the sources call it decentralized chaos. So we trade the old problem of centralized bias for. How do we handle this tension between everyone having a voice and knowing what's actually credible?
That is the challenge of the digital age, isn't it? When anyone can publish, the issue isn't finding information anymore, it's figuring out what's reliable, who has authority. The sources really emphasize this huge tension between, let's say, historical truth, or at least rigorous research, and just the sheer volume of misinformation, disinformation floating around online. You're not worried about a king burning records anymore, you're worried about an algorithm boosting lies, or just being so overwhelmed you can't find the good stuff.
Which leads us then to the final stop on this journey, 2050. This is projection, looking ahead. But it forces us to think about some really disruptive tech. If 2000 was about giving everyone a digital pen, 2050 might be about giving the pen to non-human things, decentralized networks. Okay, yeah, here's where it gets really interesting.
Definitely speculative, but based on current trends, we could be looking at totally new players writing history. Not just people, but AI, algorithmic curators sorting and presenting the past, maybe blockchain-based archivists creating unchangeable records, citizen historians collaborating across borders, maybe even across generations, in new ways. History could become this global networked thing, maybe without a single central home.
Okay, let's unpack some of that jargon. Blockchain-based archivist. What does that actually mean for keeping history safe or stable?
Right, good question. Basically, it means creating a historical record that's copied across thousands of computers in a way that's theoretically tamper-proof, an immutable ledger. Once something's recorded, no single government, no single archive can secretly change or delete it. It's being talked about as maybe the ultimate defense against censorship or politically motivated revisions of history because the record is decentralized and verified by the network.
Fascinating. And the tools are changing too. Beyond just screens, you mentioned immersive media, AR, VR holograms, history you can walk into.
Exactly. Imagine experiencing a historical event not just by reading about it, but through immersive virtual reality or augmented reality overlaying historical information onto the real world. Holographic storytelling, ethical data repositories designed for long-term preservation. The way we encounter history could become much more spatial, interactive, multisensory.
So the prediction is for history to become much more pluralistic, multimedia rich.
Sounds amazing.
Sounds amazing. But you also mentioned risks. This future, while potentially allowing for what the sources call restorative history, history that heals, it's got dangers too.
Oh, absolutely. Significant risks. It's the flip side of all this powerful tech. We really need to look closely at the projected challenges. Number one is probably bias, but in a new form. If AI curators learn from historical data that's already biased, say Eurocentric, they might just amplify that bias, right? Deciding what's important based on flawed old patterns. Then there's the huge issue of access. Who gets to create and experience this immersive history? Will it just be wealthy nations? The digital divide could become a historical divide. And even with blockchain, there's still the risk of digital erasure outside those systems, data rot, format obsolescence, new ways to lose the past.
Okay, so we've traced this power, the power to write history, from the King's Scroll through the state's textbook into the code of the blockchain. We've gone from one official story to potentially millions, constantly shifting, which I guess brings us to the real core question. We stop asking who did write history. And we have to ask who should write history.
That's the philosophical heart of it, yes. It shifts from pure power dynamics to a moral question. Who ought to be shaping our collective memory? And the sources we looked at offer some powerful ideas here. They suggest history should be written by those committed to, well, justice, dignity, truth. moving the focus from just political might to having a strong ethical compass.
And crucially, it mentions communities practicing intergenerational responsibility. That's interesting. It's not just about documenting today, but thinking about how the stories we tell now will impact people generations down the line.
Precisely, a sense of stewardship for the future. And this responsibility falls on historians, yes, but also educators, artists, technologists, anyone involved in memory work, people actively working to, democratize memory, ensure more voices are included, maybe even use history for healing and reconciliation. The goal shifts from just documenting what happened towards ensuring the archive is respectful, inclusive, and maybe even helps us build a better future.
So what's the takeaway for you listening to this? It seems unavoidable, really. The way history is written, who gets to write it? It's like a perfect mirror. It reflects our power structures, our ethics, our imagination. And as we edge closer to that predicted 2050, with all its tech, the challenge is making sure this incredibly complex, maybe AI-influenced historical record actually honors all of human experience, the full spectrum. You're kind of invited, I suppose, to be a conscious steward of memory yourself.
Yeah, don't just passively consume the stories you encounter. Think about where they come from, who's telling them, why, what tools are they using.
Right. And as you think about this journey we've taken from that centralized court to the decentralized web, here's a final thought, maybe an exercise for you. Try finding school textbooks from two different countries talking about the same historical event, maybe a war they fought against each other or a period of colonization. Just compare those two official narratives side by side. The differences you'll almost certainly find. Well, they reveal pretty much everything we've talked about today, don't they? Power, authorship, and the stories we choose to tell ourselves.